your brain's really good at ignoring stuff that it doesn't think is important. And so things that have a consistent pattern, it can actually ignore easier because it goes, oh, I know that. I'm going to ignore that. That doesn't mean anything.
Welcome to the Film Riot Podcast. I'm Ryan Conley, and today on the show we have Rob Krekel, who is the audio lead at Naughty Dog. He's worked on all kinds of video games like Uncharted and The Last of Us, and now The Last of Us 2. He's also a longtime collaborator of mine. He's done most of my short films, including my latest short film, Ballistic, and he absolutely knocked it out of the park. He's unbelievably knowledgeable when it comes to sound and just insanely talented, thus the whole audio lead at Naughty Dog thing. But we're about to jump into all that. But before we do, I want to thank today's sponsors, which is Benro. Benro makes a ton of great filmmaking gear, such as tripods, sliders, and hi-hats. We use all of their stuff on our show. We showed it recently in some of the making of for Ballistic, how we use their hi-hat. It's great to have just to be able to toss wherever you need to, and their tripods are just really, really solid. You can also get 20% off on benrousa.com by using the coupon code FilmRiot20. And I also want to thank Aperture, and Aperture is a company you hear me talk about all the time, and that's because I love the people behind the company, and I love the products that they make. They're coming out with the 120T Mark II now. This thing can dim all the way down to 1%, which is such a huge thing that I wish we would have had on Ballistic. But definitely check out filmriot.com/podcast, find the episode page for this episode, and check out their stuff there. We have links for both sponsors, including some videos of reviews we've done for those products. But now it's time for me to shut up and jump right into it with Rob. So, Rob, jumping right into where you come from, just like a brief how you got into what you're currently doing and what your current position at Naughty Dog is.
Oh, what I'm currently doing, real quick. That's hard. It's not a quick story.
Super fast. Give me the 1 minute elevator version.
Super fast is I went to school for animation, decided I wasn't very good at it, decided to switch to sound design by taking an intro class, finding out, hey, this doesn't feel like work. And then I decided to do that for a living. Got very lucky along the way, worked very hard along the way, ended up at Naughty Dog, where I am now the audio lead. So that's the short version.
What does that mean exactly to be audio lead for a video game company?
So audio lead at Naughty Dog is similar to an audio director at another studio. We kind of oversee everything that comes out of the speakers, so dialogue, music, and sound effects. My primary background is obviously through sound design and sound effects, mixing, that sort of thing. And now, as the audio lead, I have a little more purview over some of the other aspects.
So you're the boss man?
Kinda. Yeah.
My dude. And we started working together. What was the first thing we did together? Was it Proximity?
Well, it was supposed to be Outsiders.
Right, which turned into Proximity.
Yes.
And that was 2013.
2013, yeah.
How did we end up, because we've been working together since then.
Mm-hmm.
You've done almost all of my short films since then. How did we end up connecting? I don't think I really fully remember how that went down.
Through the magic of the internet, my friend.
Was it just the internets?
It was, you put out the war short with Film Riot, and
which is the worst gun sounds ever.
Me being the the first version, me being the opinionated guy, and also old school Film Riot fan, I just messaged you on Twitter. I was like, hey man, I don't know if you ever need any help with audio, but I would be, willing to help out. Just let me know. And kind of went from there.
Yeah, you were another one that was like Daniel, because when Daniel first messaged me, because now I remember, were you the one specifically that was like, hey, that sounds like paintball guns, not real guns?
I don't think so. I don't think I would have been that mean because I was a fan and I didn't want to be a jerk. So
there was somebody who said that, and I was like, yeah, that's fair. They do. They really do. And then I switched them up to better guns. But I do remember that, actually. I remember then going to your website, which had some video game stuff on it.
Yeah.
And I believe there was a picture of you standing next to like a river of some kind or something.
Yeah, probably. Recording some sound.
But it was you and Daniel were very similar, whereas Daniel sent me a message, you sent me a message like, hey, I'd love to help out. And then I go and look at your stuff and I'm like, they're lying. They're not this good, because it was like way back in the early days. So it was like, man, somebody of this caliber wants to just help out. Why?
Well, I mean, like I said, I was a fan. I loved watching Film Riot pretty much from the get-go. I don't know. I do know how I stumbled upon it. So I was watching a lot of Revision 3 stuff because the Totally Rad show, I was a fan of that show. And so I ended up watching a lot of the content on Revision 3, which at the time also included Film Riot. And so that's sort of how I came to watching your stuff.
Good old internet. Thanks, internet.
Mm-hmm. High five, internet.
High five, internet. But I do want to talk a lot about Ballistic and the other work that we've done together. But before we do that, I'm kind of just interested in what's going on with the stuff that you do for Naughty Dog and how different game audio is from film or not.
So game audio is pretty significantly different, especially when you're talking about non-cinematics. So cinematics are very much like linear, because they are. And cinematics are the scenes in which the player has no control. So if you're talking about The Last of Us, Ellie and Joel talking to each other, torturing somebody, whatever, where exposition is happening and there's no actual direct player control. Everything else in-game audio is extraordinarily different, not least of which is because you need variation. When you make something linear, you can make like a cool explosion, a cool gunshot, a cool car engine, cut it just to the picture, and you're done. When you have a player who can control, go as slow or fast, shoot or not shoot, punch, not punch, you have to have a lot of variations to cover the action so that it doesn't become repetitive and annoying.
Yeah.
And on the repetitive and annoying tilt, you have to sort of mix differently as well. So something in a film, you could have like these giant footsteps for a character that happen just during a specific scene, and the rest of the piece has more normal sounding stuff because you're trying to play up dramatic tension or something. In a game, you can try to do that and you can still kind of do it, but you have to do it much more dynamically, where you're using the context of the AI state, or you're using the context of how hard the player's pushing the button or how hard they're pushing the analog stick. There's a lot of different things to consider and that you can use that you just don't even ever have to think about in linear. In many ways, linear is, I wouldn't say easier, but it's a little more understood how you achieve a large majority of the sound in the picture. There's certainly creative challenges, but in terms of the nuts and bolts, like how you put it together, it's fairly well documented, well thought out, and there's sort of a process. In games, you sort of have to reinvent the wheel a lot because you're always trying to evolve, you're always trying to do better, you're always trying to do the latest, greatest, next best thing to immerse the player and tell the story. And oftentimes that means sort of starting from scratch with the way that you just put the sounds into the game, not creating the sounds, but getting them to play back for the player.
Yeah, because it's even getting into like perspective, and that perspective is constantly adjusting as you're playing the game.
Absolutely.
So it's like one of the things that I saw with the like an arrow being shot past the character and actually like hearing that perspective correctly.
Yeah, perspective is huge, and propagation, especially for The Last of Us. So propagation is like how sounds travel through space. So if you have an enemy in another room, how the sound of his footsteps or Foley or whatever he's doing kind of pushes its way through the door, the reverb in that room pushes its way through the door and gets to the player. That's all like really, really difficult to do in real time. It's fairly easy to do in linear. It's hard to make sound good, but you just have a reverb that sort of sounds like that place and you sort of pan it in the right position and you're good to go. But there's two aspects to the game where the player could be moving in a different spot and then that NPC bad guy could be moving, and it has to change dynamically and crossfade and move and adjust appropriately no matter where the perspective is. You're never really assured a single perspective in a game.
What's an NPC?
Non-player character.
Ah, ha, ha.
Yes.
Now I know.
There you go.
Yeah, that's what's always so interesting to me. Like in The Last of Us, the first one, when you're sneaking through all those different areas and the sound is constantly shifting, or if a window's open or if it's closed, and all that interacting in real time.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. We have a really amazingly talented audio programmer, Jonathan, who provides a lot of the technology for us, as well as a great team over at Sony that helps support us. We're really fortunate to work with super, super talented people.
And you worked on Uncharted and Last of Us 1 and 2, obviously, and all the Naughty Dog goodness. But you've done other, outside of my films, you've done other short films as well, right? And have you ever worked on a feature or just short films?
I worked, honestly, the first thing I ever did out of school was on a feature. It was on a very terrible very terrible feature-length indie film that was supposed to be a romantic comedy, but it wasn't very romantic and it wasn't very funny. But yeah, no, the title was funny. I was the supervising Foley editor on that. Yes.
Okay.
I got paid a grand total of $0 for that one. That was
fancy.
Yeah, very fancy. But hey, it was a good experience. got to work with a bunch of my friends who I graduated school with and, get a credit on a feature. So, hey, not so bad.
And you've done some stuff even that I haven't seen for mutual friends, correct?
Potentially.
That pretty much nobody has seen, but you created like monster sounds and such.
Yes.
Which is not something I believe we can talk about, but
no,
we both know what we're talking about.
I know what you're talking about, yes. One of our mutual friends.
Yeah. And the reason I bring it up is I kind of want to start shifting into creating sounds for storytelling, because that's what you really do. You're creating sounds that fit the world of the story that we're all coming together to create. So, it can't just be any punch sound or any gun sound or any, ambience or any monster sound. It has to be correct for the story.
Right.
So how are you arriving to that? How are you finding that tone? Is that conversations that you're just having with each director? And then what are the next steps that you take to hone in on what this world sounds like? Because everything in Ballistic feels right with each other. Nothing feels like it belongs in a different movie or in a different tone. It's all the same language, but it wouldn't be the same language as, Ghost House. So what is sort of the process for finding that and collaborating to invent that world and those sounds?
So a big part of the beginning of the process, especially before you've shot anything, is reading the script and sort of getting your head wrapped around where the various opportunities for storytelling with sound are and starting to think about them that early. On a project with a little more time, you could start gathering sound assets, recording things, doing things of that nature. I actually did that for Chainsaw. I actually went out and recorded a chainsaw specifically for that short because I knew the action would probably not be covered by some library that exists out there, that I wanted to get it myself.
Yeah, totally. It was very specific.
Yeah. So that's where it starts, is definitely reading the script. And then I feel like it's fairly obvious to say that you have to talk to the director. Obviously, we talk all the time. And when it regards to the short films that we've done together, it's often super helpful to have those spotting sessions where I can understand what you want and what you're expecting. Because ultimately, I'm trying to help support the director's vision, your vision, other directors I've worked with, and understanding what that is more important than my own sort of feelings. I can have my own intuition and feelings, and I feel like I've become pretty good at sort of understanding what people will want for a given project. But that being said, it's always hugely important to have those conversations early on with directors to make sure you understand what it is they need for the project.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you always have it pretty close by the time I get in there. There's just like little adjustments here and there, but it's always pretty spot on, which I'm sure has a lot to do with the fact that we've worked together for the last 5+ years.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, having that rapport makes it a bit easier, because I sort of know what you are expecting or wanting before we even have those conversations. But if it were somebody new, obviously you don't know. And sometimes what you may intuit, like, oh, this is a quote unquote realistic looking short, they may not want that, or it might not be right for the emotions they're trying to convey or the headspace they're trying to put the character in. It may need more subjective sound, more designed sound, and a realistic treatment might not work so well. So yeah, it's always sort of a new challenge at the beginning. But those conversations, I think, are of the utmost importance.
Yeah, for sure. And then with Ballistic, we did Foley on one of my projects, at least for the first time. Whereas before, it was all hand cutting the Foley, and even in which I experienced the pain of when I did Sentinel, because that was the one you were unavailable for, and I was like, "Where's Rob?" But man, it's just the worst to cut that.
Yeah.
And for this one, you were adamant about jumping into Foley. So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think Foley in particular, and for those that don't know, Foley is sort of the normal sounds that people assume are recorded on set.
Right.
So the sound of people's footsteps, the sound of their cloth moving around, the sound of them picking up and putting down props. It's the stuff that really makes it believable. Due to whatever circumstances, it's often not gotten very well for production audio. It's not production audio's job to get those sounds. It's their job to get the dialogue as cleanly and as clearly as possible. So it's not really any fault. It's not really the focus. In the past, yeah, hand cutting Foley, and that's basically my personal belief, is like Foley is one of the most important pieces in the mix. So I refuse to put out something that doesn't even have some kind of pass done. So I torture myself because we typically don't have the budgets required to get to a Foley stage because they're fairly expensive. But I just can't let it go out the door without something, because it just makes such a huge difference, especially when you're talking about YouTube or just purely digital filmmakers. Often that's the first thing they go, well, we don't need that.
Yeah, and there's such a difference in the immersion into that scene without that, because it just feels empty and it feels cheap without it. Even if you aren't pinpointing what's missing, you feel what's missing, because it just no longer feels like a world that's alive without it.
Absolutely. And
it's all the most obvious sounds that exist.
Right. And the other important thing to understand is that I don't have the music when I start these things. So I go in assuming that there's going to be no music. So everything needs to be covered so that I have an option while mixing. Oh, we want to hear the cloth rustle here. We want to hear more footsteps here. We want to hear this gear noise here. We want to hear this prop pickup there. If you don't cover those things and then you get the music and it's sparse, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You got to either go back and spend more time, or you're going to put it out and it's just going to sound incomplete. I'm always a bigger fan of having all the options available to you during the mix and then removing them and making the choice to be reductive as opposed to like, oh shit, we need to add more. So on this one, when we were talking about it earlier, I was pretty adamant because we had enough of a budget where I knew that we could get at least one day on a stage. And it's a funny story. I know I've told you this before, but I think it'd be funny for everyone else here too. While I was working on Uncharted 4, we went to a certain Foley stage to help with our Jeep Foley. And while we're there, just kind of, talking, chatting with the engineer and the artist there. The engineer, John, who's also a Foley artist, I sort of mentioned that I worked on short films, and he was asking about it, and so I mentioned Film Riot. He's like, oh, Film Riot? We love that channel. I watch that all the time with my sons. We're totally like indie filmmakers on the side. I'm like, oh my God, it's such a small world. And this is a guy, John and Dan O'Connell at One Step Up, who have worked on like 400 something films, including films like Speed, all the way up to like Deadpool 2. I mean, these guys.
Speed's the one that I geeked out hard over.
These guys are
shut up,
amazing Foley guys, and for them to be fans of Film Riot was pretty amazing to me. And so when we finished Uncharted 4, I said, hey, if ever we have a project come in, I'd love to use you guys. So I'll let you know. And then Ballistic started happening. I was calling around town to various Foley stages trying to get it booked, and everyone's very busy. And so I took a chance on One Step Up, and John got back to me and he was like, absolutely, we'll figure it out. And they worked us in, and they worked late, and they worked like till 2 a.m. after they did their full day shift. And they did a phenomenal job for us. And I'm really, really happy that they got to be a part of something that Ryan Connolly has directed, something that has the Film Right Association with it. So
I
cool.
love them. I just love them so much.
Yeah.
It was so important for this one too, especially just hearing it singled out, just how much, like it's one of those things that how much goes into it. And then when you hear it, you're still blown away by how much it's adding and even just how much nuance is there, that even with the music loud is playing into it so much. Just like with all the baddies, all their gear has like a metallic sound to it because you can see that they have all that on their gear. So as they're moving and getting thrown and landing, you're hearing all that extra nuances that is immersing you so much more into this world and bringing the world so much more alive. There was a lot of times even in the edit where Lucas and we just knew and be like, this is fine for now. We know what's missing here is sound. It's just the cut is good. And we'd watch it with the sound off and we're like, yes, the cut is good. The pace is great. It's just missing that Rob Krekel stank. And once we get that audio in there, this whole scene's going to come to life in the right way. And it did, which is something really interesting too. When it comes to editing, you have to edit imagining the final sound because the sound is so key, especially when you're talking about an action scene.
Yeah.
So it can be hard to kind of cut those scenes without the sound in there. So sometimes you're just imagining it. I even talked recently to Evan, the editor of John Wick 2, and he was talking about how they would watch it making their own sound effects just with their mouths just like, you know what I mean? Because I mean, you get some temp sound in there, but especially when you're on a really tight deadline, you don't have a ton of time to really get get in there and go nuts with a lot of the sound design.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't fit anyway because you're getting stock sounds. But yeah, man, that Foley is so key.
Yeah, and that's why I offered up doing the audio splits, because I feel like people hear about Foley and they understand that it's valuable and they think they know what it is. I think it's super valuable and it's underrepresented to actually hear it by itself.
Yeah, totally.
So that you understand like everything that is there. And so having those split outs for those two scenes in the behind the scenes pack, like, I feel like that information is just super underrepresented. Even I'm like a connoisseur of like DVD special features.
Yeah.
And there's like literally like 2 DVDs that I've found that have that sort of thing. One of them's the Lord of the Rings Two Towers and the other is Fight Club, where they actually sort of like split out different sounds so you could sort of hear the different elements that are building a scene. And I just think it's such a cool thing to sort of like dissect the mix to see. It's just as cool as seeing those visual effect breakdowns, I think. Like you can kind of see a little bit behind the curtain.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
Yeah, I would love to, next go around, do something in depth with the whole Foley process, just because I'm obsessed with it. And you know me, I adore sound and I would just love to be in the room. So it would just be a good excuse to be in the room.
Oh, yeah.
But it would be great to do something in depth with the process on the next one. But let's talk about a specific scene. So say the bedroom scene where the mom wakes young Dana up. There's a lot of stylistic choices in that scene, and just, for you approaching that from the audio perspective, how are you finding a lot of those sounds and the tone? I mean, obviously we've discussed it, the tone, you've seen the temp cut, so you know what the tone is, but how are you going about selecting the sounds? And is it a matter of just going through sounds until one hits you and you're like, that's the right one? Or is it just pure experience and you just know where to get it?
So which sounds are we referring to? Like the sort of like violent flashes?
All of the above. You picked a different siren, a very different siren than what was in the temp. And it was so much better. I actually think, we've never talked about this, but it sustains so much longer. So there's very rare like moments of resolution for you. So it's this constant tonal tension that's happening where you're wanting it to resolve. You're wanting it to take that dip down, but it doesn't.
Yeah.
And I bet no one has really thought about that, but it is creating more tension just by not resolving with that dip down to the back up, just by holding it for so long. Was that why you picked it?
Yes, that was absolutely the intention of that, because the one that we had from temp was sort of more frequent and just felt like it was drawing attention to itself in a non-subconscious way. It was like, oh, there's an alarm. You got to listen. It's scary, right? Having the longer whine going. The other thing is it's pitch matched to match what the music is doing as well, so that it can come in and out of the music and it all sorts of works harmoniously.
Which is an interesting dance that I never thought about till this project, actually.
Yeah.
That you and Daniel actually have to have a collaboration of pitch, because the music has to match certain tonal elements like this, because we have the wind chimes, and we have the siren and a few other things, and those things have to actually match in pitch so they're not fighting against each other.
Right. You don't want it to sound dissonant in a way that sounds wrong, not stressful or tense. Like you're trying to drive that tense home. You don't want it to be like annoying and weird. Like, what the hell does that sound like? You don't want it to take people out of the scene. And so, yeah, having the longer, less undulating alarm is definitely a conscious choice. I actually ended up making some of those takes longer because the asset I used was only like 2 of those together. So it was like, and so I just ended up extending those and making them a bit longer to kind of accomplish that. And there was a couple times where if you watch it back and you sort of like count how long they're not a consistent length. So that's the other thing that makes them sort of uneasy on a subconscious level, is like you're trying to anticipate when it's going to release, but you can't because it's never releasing at the same time.
Right. You can't kind of get a time lock with it.
Right. So that was the other thing to help it. The other thing that does is your brain's really good at ignoring stuff that it doesn't think is important. And so things that have a consistent pattern, it can actually ignore easier because it goes, oh, I know that. I'm going to ignore that. That doesn't mean anything. But if it doesn't have a consistent pattern, when it does release finally, you'll actually hear it versus ignoring it.
Yeah. Man, that's great. And it worked really well. Especially my favorite moment of it is the stairwell scene, because the stairwell scene, as far as sound goes, is a little more withheld, especially the music. Everything's a little bit more withheld and less in your face with it. So the siren sort of peeks out from the crowd a little more, and just not having that roll off created so much tension, I think, consciously or subconsciously.
Yeah, I think so. That was the goal. So I'm glad to hear that it achieved that goal for you.
But back to the bedroom scene, when you're building that out, are there other pieces underneath the bedroom scene that aren't necessarily in your face sorts of sound, stuff that you wouldn't necessarily hear, but is filling out the scene or creating a certain tone that you're looking for?
No, honestly, at the point where the music came in, the music kind of provides that underlying sort of droning tension. And so the siren was sort of the counterpoint to that, the high end, so that it didn't really need any other like sound design underneath to accomplish that. The hardest part of that scene for me was actually editing the dialogue to get it to sound consistent and good, because it was a bunch of different takes cut together with sort of different inflection and breaths and things. And sometimes that can be the most challenging thing to get together to make it feel right, especially because she's whispering but intense. It's a very tricky sort of thing to mix, because you don't want to make it really loud because she's trying to be quiet, but also you can't make it too quiet because there's all these other things going on and the music's happening and the siren and everything. So you can't put it down to the level where it's actually a whisper. So trying to mix that was sort of a tricky bit for sure.
Yeah,
but
it was definitely one of those moments where we're like, Rob will make this work, because we were going for performance, because that scene as a whole was very tricky. Just getting it to work with the piece, because originally it's scripted and shot to be, it's a little bit longer and it's a straightforward scene, beginning to end scene without that. We have that jump in there and it's a little more stylistic, even how we leave it. And initially that wasn't the plan, but it just wasn't working. It didn't feel tense. It didn't feel like there was a ticking clock, like there's a man in the house, we need to go. It just didn't, it just felt bland and slow. So we were finding ways to make that work. And one of the ways to make that work was by finding very specific moments of the different inflection, like you talked about, to build to what we needed to, and then having that subjective flash break, and then how we ended up leaving, and then that ended up making that work. But yeah, like you said, initially the sound was very all over the place because of it.
Yeah.
With that, what's sort of the process in cleaning that up and making that dialogue fit together? Is that just like a straightforward EQ thing, or what is the dialogue editing process? I don't think I've ever asked you that, actually.
So I will give you my best explanation. I am not a great dialogue editor. Is not my wheelhouse. I do it because I have to. It takes a very specific set of folks, and there's definitely folks who can do it way better than I do. But the basic process is you're trying to smooth out the production audio to where it all sounds even. That's kind of the nutshell version. What that means is you're taking the various microphone perspectives, whether it's lavalier mics or boom mics. You're selecting the ones that sound the best. You try to stick with the same mic because the character changes pretty drastically if you go from like a boom to a lav to a boom to a lav. It kind of can create very obvious like advertisements of the cuts that are happening. So your goal is to kind of smooth that all out and make it play correctly and smoothly. But you're also listening for things like breathing and little mouth noises and things that can be distracting, where you're trying to remove the things that are distracting and smooth out and make realistic the things that you want to hear, like breathing. And so that's sort of the basics of it. The other thing you have to do is you have to make sure you have enough room tone to kind of fill in the gaps. Oftentimes, if you have like direction happening on the mic, you have to like cover that up with room tone. Oftentimes when tracks come in from an editor, they've simply edited out, you know, all of you saying, okay, Dana, this, or okay, Rachel, like this, right? Like that. That stuff gets all cut out, but then there's just these giant blank chunks. And so you have to fill those in because the ear will pick up on those changes. Kind of like I was explaining with the siren. When the siren is irregular, it's easier for your brain to notice. Well, when your noise behind your dialogue is irregular, it's really easy for your brain to notice too, which is in the negative way. You don't want the brain to notice that stuff. So that stuff all needs to get smoothed out, filled up with room tone. And that's sort of the goal of dialogue editing. Just making sure it all sounds clear and that you can hear everything intelligibly in terms of the storytelling and the dialogue.
How often are you grabbing like the room tone takes versus just trying to find silence in the take that you're currently editing?
It depends. So when I get the OMF from Lucas, he has handles on the scenes, so all the edits have a little bit of a handle to pull out. Unfortunately, they're not usually long enough to where I can really dig through a bunch of stuff. So I'll often go back to the original production dialogue if I need more room tone. There's a couple nifty apps and little plugins and things where you can actually like feed it a little bit of room tone and it'll generate stuff for you.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty helpful.
I actually have never heard of that.
Yeah, there's some ones that have been made in Max MSP, but I want to say that RX has one now where it'll actually ambience match might be it. Anyway, yeah, there's various tools that are available to kind of help make your room tone sort of easier to come by. I often find that there's never enough, and making it is sort of sometimes difficult. But the other thing to remember is the room tone, it doesn't need to sound super great. Like, it doesn't need to be perfectly smooth. And I mean, that's ideally what you want. But if you have a small bit that you duplicate, and then crossfade, and it's a little bumpy, but it sort of just fills in the general sort of noise that's in the room. Once you get music in, once you get the actual ambient backgrounds that are cut, the edited stuff in to help cover that up, it just helps to smooth it out. Actually, I think in some of the stuff in the BTS audio breakdowns, you might hear some of the dialogue editing have like a little bit of room tone in it where like it kind of sounds choppy, where it's like noise being just duplicated over and over again. But when you're listening to it in the mix, it completely just gets lost and gets smoothed over.
Yeah, totally. So then you have the dialogue track, like in the audio breakdown, we have the dialogue track, and then you have the sound effects track and the Foley track, and then the music track. Do you want to real quick explain the difference between Foley and sound effects, that they are not the same thing?
Sure. Yeah. Well, Foley is the stuff that is recorded custom to picture by an artist on a stage. So it's bespoke specifically to your project. Oftentimes, sound effects, often called hard effects, is stuff from a library. So it's not recorded specifically for your film. It's stuff that's cut in or designed by a sound designer to then work for your film, but it's not recorded to picture typically. That's sort of the difference. Sound effects often encompass like guns and explosions and things that you can't do on a Foley stage, whereas Foley is almost always related to hand props and feet and cloth rustles. But that's not all Foley can do. Foley can also provide lots of different, more designy things. Gary Hecker is sort of famous for adding his voice on the Foley stage into various aspects as like a design layer, which is kind of cool. Obviously, it's processed. It's not just his naked voice, but so
Do you have
Foley
any examples of that?
So he is responsible for the DC films, including like Batman vs. Superman and Justice League. And I think the one, Man of Steel. So in Man of Steel, there's like a scene of the baddies getting frozen up into the sort of like prison. A lot of that stuff is recorded on the Foley stage, like the ice cracking and the ice freezing. And then he sort of does this vocal sort of wind type sound, like that kind of just layers in to have an interesting vocal quality to that freezing process that makes it sort of alien.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so there's certainly stuff like that Foley can provide, but typically a lot of that stuff is hard effects or sound effects.
Sure. And who's one of or some of your favorite sound designers?
Ben Burt is definitely why I do what I do. Ben is famous for almost all the most iconic sounds in the history of sound. He was the sound designer on all the Star Wars films, except for the more recent ones, Indiana Jones, and so on. He's made some of the most iconic things that even people who are very unfamiliar with sound or how films are made know. So the lightsaber, the blaster, Chewbacca's voice, R2-D2's voice. I could go on, but yeah, he approached things from a completely unique perspective and is a constant inspiration. And then not second favorite, but my other favorite is Gary Rydstrom. Gary Rydstrom is responsible for a lot of Pixar's early films, as well as one of your favorite films, Ryan, Jurassic Park. He is
hello. Now he's my favorite.
The mastermind behind the raptor squeals and the T-Rex roar, which is actually a baby elephant, among other things. But yeah, those two guys in particular, Gary is extraordinarily good at picking the right sound for the moment. So it's not necessarily like designing a crazy sound to fill something. It's like picking basically an unlayered sound or maybe a minimally layered sound that just feels right for the thing that it is on screen.
Yeah.
A lot of the Pixar movies, the early ones, are like that, where it's not this crazy design thing. It's like, oh, it's a pen click, and that's like the sound of footsteps for a character in one of the shorts. Like, it's brilliant. It's like so simple, but it's so brilliant and it feels so right. Like, I aspire to be like that, where I can just select the right sound with sort of minimal manipulation and make it work. And then if I had to call one more guy out, probably David Farmer. David Farmer's creature stuff is a constant inspiration. He's responsible for most of the creatures in the Lord of the Rings series, and he's also worked on a lot of the creatures in the Marvel movies as well. He's just a extraordinarily creative guy when coming to designing creatures. His creatures always sound pretty amazing.
Speaking of creatures, you designed one for a mutual friend, as we talked about before. Yeah. What was your process in building out that sound?
Oh, man, that one was hard. It was really hard because it was all storyboards, essentially. It wasn't even a real film. And so there was a lot of imagination required. But we had talked about kind of what he thought it might sound like and what the creature might be. And so bird-like sort of sounds kind of came to my mind as a source. And so I tried a whole bunch of different stuff. Creating creatures is phenomenally difficult, and a lot of it is just experimentation and like happy accidents. And that's sort of how that happened. It's just like I just was playing with a bunch of different sounds. I found one that I liked. I tried to make more like that, and that's sort of how that process went. Mostly haphazard at best.
Yeah, it's kind of like going with your gut. I mean, I do a lot of that. We've talked about it on the show before. Sometimes things are just like, when you know, and it's just going with your gut. So sounds like you have a lot of that as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's any creative endeavor, any artist can probably relate to that, where you just kind of follow your gut and you see where it takes you. And, along the way, you probably find a different path to where you were going. But yeah, trusting your instincts usually is a good idea, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely think our instincts are informed by experience. It's just like things that are now ingrained in us that we can't exactly articulate. It's just pushing us one way or the other.
Yeah, I think instincts are bred by intense practice.
Yeah,
so
totally.
In order to develop your instincts, you have to have, the old like 10,000 hour kind of adage. You have to have practiced a lot before you can really develop those instincts. My favorite analogy for this sort of thing is like Renaissance painters were apprentices of masters, and they had to replicate their master style exactly before they were even like allowed to develop their own style. I feel like that's kind of a brilliant way to work. It's like you need to chase the people that inspire you until you have enough experience to where you can then develop a voice of your own.
Right.
I feel like that's like a really kind of, it's a lost lesson a lot of the time, especially in our YouTube generation, where people want to watch like a 10-minute YouTube video and then they think they know everything about a certain subject.
Yeah, you're speaking my language.
I mean, listen, like Film Riot provides that to a degree, but like you have a continuum of information that has evolved over time, which I think is really important, and that people need to understand is like, you don't start where you are now. You started where you were like before YouTube even happened.
Yeah, totally. And Film Riot has always tried to be, and strives even more now to be something where it's not, here's exactly how you do it. It's, hey, here's how I'm currently doing this, and hopefully serves more for opening up, little pockets in your brain of ideas and creativity, and also inspiration to get off your butt and actually do it. Because I really want Film Riot to continue. Sure, we do like button by button stuff sometimes on, hey, here's how you can do this. And then hopefully they take that technique and they use it for something totally different, which a lot of people do. And it's great. Mm-hmm. But I always talk about Movie Magic. Do you remember that show on Discovery Channel, Movie Magic?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I watch that all the time.
Yes. Man, that was kind of like my first film school. And that's why sometimes we get in the comments, especially when we do something like Ballistic, where it's, definitely a higher budget. We have this huge crew. We shot some of it in LA. We're on a proper dolly with all the bells and whistles of at least an indie film. And then you get comments of people being like, yeah, well, we can't get a special effects artist and all that gear, so this is useless. And it's like, well, man, you might be in your own way to ever being successful there. You know what I mean? And it always worries me, is because it's like, this person could be the next great filmmaker, but that thought process might stop you from becoming that, because it's a defeatist thought process, and you're not looking at it as, I'm going to be there one day. This is really great information for me to have. But not only that, just like with movie magic, I never watched it being like, oh, they have millions of dollars, I can't do that. I was like, oh, okay, so that's what forced perspective is, or
it's like,
that's how they do that certain technique. So I can take that and scale it to what I have right now and pull it off in my own way. And it's more of an idea of opening doors of creativity and possibility that lead to bigger and better.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, going back to Ben Burt, like the way I even found out about Ben Burt, there was a, like Corn Pops had a, like, send X amount of box lids back and you'll get a behind the scenes Star Wars VHS. And so on that VHS, there was actually a small section about the sound of Star Wars and about Ben Burt going and banging on a guy wire for the blaster sounds, and like that kind of stuff blew my mind. I was like, oh my gosh, This is amazing. I'm going to go bang on a guy wire just so I can hear this sound. Like it was so inspiring and just made me want to learn more and do more. I hope that all the things that we do in providing information and providing these windows into what people, want to learn about inspires them to go try things. I think that's the best thing ever. I remember, I don't know if it was Movie Magic or another one, just watching old like Super 8 footage that was from Spielberg of him like, making his like little war films and things where him and his buddies are just out in the desert and the dirt and the muck, and they have a plank propped up by a piece of rock, and they put a bunch of dirt on it, and they have him run by and step on it, and it looks like a grenade explodes behind him because he's just throwing all this dirt in the air. It's like, those are kids playing, and Spielberg then made Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah, totally.
It's like he didn't start at Saving Private Ryan. He started making completely improvised special effects with no money, with just a stick and a rock and some dirt.
Yeah.
Like literally playing in the dirt.
Yeah. And now we have access to, I mean, we even did then with the, Movie Magic, but you have access to so many ideas that maybe you can't do that exact idea, but you can take what someone was doing, like, take the idea of what is an actual explosive in the ground, firing the dirt up, and, oh, well, they triggered that dirt for the moment. Well, how can I do that with no money? Hey, what if we did a seesaw effect and just had someone slam on it? And, you know what I mean? Not that that's how he came up with the idea, but that's like a perfect example of what I mean about taking a creative solution and process that might not be something yet you can accomplish right now, but then scale it.
Yep.
What's behind that idea. That's why we're trying to put out a lot of why we did things and just the technique behind how this thing was accomplished as much as possible, or just in general, what happened. Here's behind the curtain of how this moment was constructed, what went into it, these wires, X, Y, and Z. Again, not to say that you could do it right now, but one, if you are lucky enough to get on a set, you're prepped for it. When I went on my first big set, I had no idea what to expect. I had no idea what it was going to be like. It was nerve-wracking, and just figuring out that whole thing in language from square one, which is one of the reasons I really want to do these bigger projects and put this stuff out like we're doing, even showing the process that you go through as well, just so, for those of us that are lucky enough to get on those sets, it will help you. Just lost Rob. Crap. I lost Rob. He's calling me back. Here we go. You're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry.
My God, am I that boring?
No, something awful happened, and after we were talking about the plank thing, it just went to high-pitched squealing from your end, and I tried to fix it here.
Well, that's basically just me talking.
So I probably missed the last 2 or 3 minutes of what you were saying.
Well, just to end my thought was basically, I don't know what my thought was. It probably wasn't
technology.
Technology. The point is, it's just showing off the process that we go through to where hopefully, for the people that do end up getting on to a larger set, it preps you to some degree. And it's just always odd to me to complain about like what software someone uses, or that they might have an Alexa as their camera, or they might have a budget for the thing, and you're teaching how to use these things and how all of this works, and then to complain about that because you don't have access to it is as ridiculous as complaining when you go to a film school that they're not teaching you on an iPhone. Like, why would you want that?
Yeah.
It's like we mix those episodes in and do that DIY stuff as more as inspiration, but do you really want to be there forever? Or do you want the show to scale as well?
Right.
To keep bringing that information.
It's almost like people are a little spoiled with how much information is out there, because I don't know about you, but I was so hungry to learn how movies were made, and we only had Movie Magic and these VHS tapes and things. Like, there wasn't even DVD special features at that time. Like, that didn't even exist.
Right. Yeah,
And so
totally.
we were so hungry to find out any little kernel, any little morsel. Now it's like there's so much to learn. There's
It's so
much
easily
information out
accessible.
there. Yeah, it's a totally different kettle of fish.
And free information
Yeah.
too. So it's like, is it that it's like taken for granted, or is it that it didn't need to be worked for? Because even, we got information, but we had to fight to find it or to figure it out or whatever. Or is it just that, there's some people who are so passionate about it that they'll attack it, and that's just who they are. And then there's others that do it more as a hobby, and that's just what it is. I have no idea. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I'm just really glad that, and I talked about it, not long ago. It's just that I came up before the YouTube view chasing.
Yeah.
But anyway, speaking of YouTube, I'm sure you watch a bunch of stuff. I'm sure people even send you stuff to watch of their work. What would you say in online, short films and just newer work? What would you say sound-wise is something, other than Foley, since we discussed that already, something that keeps coming up again and again as something that could be fixed? Like, for instance, for me, for the feedback I would give when I'm sending stuff, it's usually pacing. Like, the pacing is usually way off. So what would be something for you that you're seeing constantly that could be something people could be adjusting and doing better?
Well, if we're talking about short films, it sort of depends, but a lot of them just don't pay attention to audio like at all, which it sounds counterintuitive, but a lot of the people just don't have probably the knowledge or the experience to even address things. You guys are sort of benefit from coming from a musical background, bands and things. So you sort of had an idea that sound was important. And a lot of folks that send stuff don't necessarily think about sound, or they don't maybe ask anyone about it. And there are so many other problems often that sound is sort of at the bottom of the list. But for me, I feel like if you fixed at least some of the sound issues, maybe some of their storytelling issues would sort of be less intense.
Right.
But
so it sounds like you're saying those issues are coming from production itself, that the thought process into actually recording as properly as possible isn't there in production.
A lot of folks they use the on-camera mic, and it just kind of is what it is. It has different perspectives that are not appropriate for the scenes, and it's all cut together, and no one pays attention to smoothing out. So yeah, but beyond that, on short films that do pay attention to audio, oftentimes mixing is really difficult, especially for YouTube. Mixing is just difficult in general, but mixing for digital, because there's so many different ways that people watch stuff. Like, a lot of people are watching on their phones. A lot of people watch on laptop speakers. So trying to listen back to your mix on all those different potential avenues that people are going to watch it is pretty beneficial, and I'm not sure everyone is doing that. There's a thing called mono compatibility that I don't know many people are aware of, but most phones, at least up until recently, are mono, and so they only have a single speaker, which is very old school in terms of audio. But due to the way physics work, there can be something called phase cancellation, a stereo sound that has two channels left and right. When you fold them down to be a single channel mono, depending on the phase relationship of the sounds going on, you can have this phenomena called phase cancellation, which actually literally makes sounds drop out and go away. And a lot of people don't necessarily know about that, and so they'll just make their stereo mix, they'll put it on YouTube, and then someone will go listen on their phone, and it'll get half the audio. Because of this phenomena.
It's so true.
And I don't think anyone really knows or pays attention, but that's it's kind of unique to our digital media these days, just because there's so many places that people watch things. You don't really have to worry about that in the cinema, obviously. But
totally.
Yeah, that's just something that I've definitely noticed.
Yeah, even the device that it's being consumed on is even something that I'm taking into account when thinking about my short films, writing, directing, editing, all that stuff, the visual effects, because you just know there's a huge portion of people that are just going to be watching it on their phone, which is a bummer, but it's the time we live in, so it's fine. You just got to embrace that and work toward it. But that's a really great tip. And coming up to the end of this discussion, for the last question, I would say for maybe somebody a bit younger wanting to get started into this, what would you say is a good thing to just start doing now to start building their experience and their talent to practice, as you were saying before, and B, what would be a good first step to them start heading toward the direction they might want to go if sound design is the route they're wanting to take?
Sure. To start with, I would say get yourself a relatively inexpensive pocket recorder, a Zoom, Tascam. There's like a plethora of these recorders now. Get the best one you can get, but don't feel like you have to spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars so that you can start recording sounds. Because ultimately, as a sound designer, your library of sounds that you have to utilize is extremely important to your creative voice. And you will find that when you record a lot of your own sounds, those go into your mental catalog as much as they go into your digital one. And you will recall those things readily than sounds that you've never really heard before from some library. And oftentimes when you're recording stuff out in the wild, you will get happy accidents all the time. You'll be out there to record, some power lines that are buzzing, and you'll get a weird bird, and you'll record the weird bird for 10 minutes. And that wasn't the reason you went out there. So things like that happen kind of all the time, but those make a mental impression on you. I find that when you need a weird bird, you go, oh yeah, I recorded that one when I was recording those power lines. Where do I have that in my library? Okay, let me find it. I find that's really, really important. If you are fortunate enough to get, commercial sound libraries, there are some great resources to get commercial sound libraries. Like A Sound Effect is a great resource. There's lots of small boutique libraries that don't cost a lot of money. And then there's, the standard Hollywood Edge and Sound Ideas, but also Boom Library is a great one. The Recordist is phenomenal. And these guys provide sort of a lot of the great stuff that, we as sound designers use. But a general guideline with those sound libraries is when you get them, listen to them. I know that sounds weird and counterintuitive, but oftentimes people get a library, they get the one sound they need, and then they just throw it into their project, and then they ignore the rest. It is really valuable to know your sound library, to listen to the takes. Just the same reason that you should be recording a lot. When you listen through to the sounds that you have in your library, you're creating like a mental map. You're creating a mental catalog so that you can more easily recall things that maybe are interesting to you. So that's sort of on the intro bit. In terms of education, I'm actually a really big fan of formal education. I feel like it's getting a bad rap these days because, people want to learn digitally. They just want to go on YouTube, get the quick and dirty information and go. I find for sound in particular, because it's very expensive to have a sound studio, to have all these different microphones, to have all these recorders, to have the opportunity to collaborate and work with other people, it's very difficult to do that and not go to school for it. I found when I went to school, the best thing about it was not necessarily the professors or the classes, but it was the access. It was the access to the rooms. The multi-million-dollar recording studios, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars of microphones and recorders that I could take out and use whenever I wanted.
Yeah.
That was amazing. You will not get that on your own. You just can't. It's too expensive. Unless you're independently wealthy or you have really, really rich family members who are willing to help you out, it's just prohibitively expensive to do that on your own.
Yeah. That was like the entire reason I went to Full Sail is because I just wanted to go to a school where I would get access to that gear and be shown how to use it. Mm-hmm. And then, just basically learn enough to leave and then go start doing the rest of that learning.
Right. And kind of touched on it, but what we do is collaborative. I work with Ryan, right? I work with you. I work with various other folks. I work at Naughty Dog, and it's 300 some odd people here. These things that we make are not sole endeavors. They're not a solo group. It's a band, right? And everyone's got to be in sync with each other. And the only way you're going to get in sync with other folks or learn how to do that is, again, to practice. And you're going to be forced to do that when you're at school. You're going to have to collaborate with folks that have different opinions than you and have different ideas and maybe have better ideas. And it's a really good ego check to go to a place where you have to collaborate with folks to create something. And it's not a perfect emulation of what you're going to face when you're in the real world, but it's pretty darn good starting point that you might not otherwise get being on your own, just watching YouTube videos.
Nice, man. Great. On that note, I'll say thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And until the next project.
Oh, yes. Very excited.
So that's it for today. If you want to find Rob online, of course, you can go to filmriot.com/podcast, find the episode page for this episode, and you'll be able to find his social media and other work there. You can find me online at twitter.com/Ryan_Conley. Next week, I'm going to be talking to Chase Smith, who was my DP on Ballistic. It was his first short film that he's ever done as a DP. He's done a bunch of other work, big commercials, music videos, things like that, but he had never done a narrative project like this. So it was really interesting to sort of dive in and talk to him about that. So definitely come back for that next week. And until then, don't forget to write, shoot, edit, repeat.